hybrid
in progress.
And as you may have just heard, we've got a group of people here in the seminar room at Stanford, and we're very delighted to have our speaker today, Sendhil Mullainathan. Sendhil is the Roman Family University Professor of Computation and Behavioral Science at Chicago Booth. His current research uses machine learning to understand complex problems in human behavior, social policy, and especially medicine, where computational techniques have the potential to uncover biomedical insights from large-scale health data. He teaches a course on artificial intelligence, and his past work has combined insights from economics and behavioral science with causal inference tools in the lab, in the field of natural experiments to study social problems such as discrimination and poverty. Prior to joining Booth, Sendhil Mullainathan was a professor of economics at Harvard University, and he began his academic career, like me, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Sendhil's a certified genius, having earned the recognition from the MacArthur Foundation, but more importantly, he's a genuinely nice guy who works on interesting questions. Today, Sendhil will discuss his paper on algorithmic behavioral science, the automated discovery of human biases. Welcome, Sendhil.
Thank you. I'm excited to present this work. It is very, I guess I would say it's close to hot off the presses. Some parts aren't even finished. And part of what I was hoping to do is just to get feedback. It's a very different kind of project. So let me tell you a little bit about my background. What really motivated this is that I've done work on sort of behavioral science. And I think many people think of behavioral science as something like this. One of my former students and postdocs has sort of akin it to something closer to this is what behavioral science is. Reasonable people making otherwise odd choices. And I used to have this slide. One of my students says, it's no fun that it's not fair that you make fun of Brad Pitt. So I said, okay, I'll make fun of myself as well. This is an even odder choice. At some point, this would be a very interesting jacket to buy. I'll let you decide whether I bought it or not. And in deciding how we make the choices we do in odd ways, in deciding why we do what we do, it's one of the sort of oldest questions known to human beings. I think we distrust ourselves. That is, we question the ability of introspection, et cetera. So when we have conjectures for why we think we do what we do, we've invented a whole scientific process for taking these conjectures and testing them in data. That is the hallmark of everything that most everybody does. But the question I want to ask today is different. It's not to dwell into that process. In fact, the vast majority of papers you do are in that little arrow. I want to ask a different question, which is, we do this in behavioral science, we do this in all of these areas. I suppose I'm probably going to lose my economics PhD degree for having put economics not just below sociology, but below Moneyball. I don't know what this says. All right, we can edit this in post-production, right? So the question I want to ask is, where do these conjectures come from? The conjectures that we use, that we so carefully test and put the entire machinery of science to work. Well, I had an idea. I heard a little anecdote. Oh, I noticed something in the world. Oh, I remembered something interesting. It's very intriguing that the right-hand side of this figure, which is where all science takes place, is very rigorous. But the left-hand side is quite sort of a messy human process. There is a pre-scientific process that is the bulk of the work. And this is what happens there. And it's actually kind of heroic to leave this early phase to the human mind, because if we distrust the mind, which there are reasons to, we are trusting it to notice its own flaws. It's kind of a heroic assumption the mind can look at itself and see what's wrong with itself. There's a Polanyi paradox and Nisbet and Wilson. These are both types of scholars who have articulated how it's very hard for people to tell what they know and why they do what they do. In the Polanyi paradox, this comes up when we try to have expert systems. When we try to code expert systems and we ask experts, how do you do what you do? You tend to find their answers don't actually reconcile with what they're actually doing. In Nisbet and Wilson, this is amongst the most beautiful psychology studies. You should definitely read this paper if you've not read it. It's called Telling More Than We Know. It's sort of an indictment of our capacity to articulate why we do what we do. Given all of this evidence.
So two questions.
Yeah,
the first one is it okay to ask questions?
Oh, please ask questions as I go along.
Okay, so yeah, and we'll try and get questions from online through the Q&A function, right? Yeah, Q&A function online. We'll look at those as well. And anyone here, if you want to raise a question, but let's focus our questions on sort of clarifying questions initially, and then we can have a broader 10 minutes at the end for broader discussion. So my clarifying question was, this you described this as messy, but didn't you also say that the scientific process is meant to sort of clean that up and
Yes.
so that we're trying to create a process that
Exactly
makes it
right.
less messy?
That's exactly right. We see the messiness on the left and we clean it beautifully put it. We see the messiness on the left and clean it up on the right.
Okay.
And the question I want to say though is the messiness on the left becomes a rate limiting step. The ideas that the mind can dream up becomes the rate limiting step of science. And so what I want to ask today is I want to ask the question, well, what choice do we have? We've done what we can. We're very scientific on the right. So what more do you want from me? Well, I do think we have a choice. Let me just make one trivial observation. This messy human process is actually a messy empirical human process. All of these things over here are some form of data. When I say I use my intuition, introspection, anecdotes, observations, they are all data-driven in some way. So if it's a data-driven process, could we have a more robust process for generating hypotheses from data? And in particular, what I want to investigate today is, could algorithms serve to generate conjectures about our own behavior that are very distinct from the kinds we may generate? So to your point, Eric, I want to ask, can we be more robust on the left?
Mm-hmm.
And one reason to do it, I'll just do this video very quickly. One reason to get interested in this whole activity, what got me interested, is there's just a host of things where you come to see that algorithms just see the world differently. And here I'm going to do something stupid. I'm going to lean heavily on the word see. Like I'm going to take it so literally. You're like, oh my goodness, he doesn't understand metaphor, which might be true as well. I'm not sure. I don't understand puns, so maybe I don't understand metaphor. This is a research team at MIT that did this very cool thing with videos of babies. So here's a video, and then now here's the same video digitally processed. Do you notice something there? You can literally see the heart beating, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is, in a typical computer image, an algorithm can see the detection of the heartbeat. The best we can do is detecting blushing, and you can't even detect if I'm blushing. I mean, I feel like I'm throwing down the gauntlet here. But oh yeah, sorry, yeah. What we have here, therefore, is we have this aspect of things where the algorithm can take the video and notice something in it that we could never detect. So carrying that metaphor forward, could algorithms look at our behavior and make conjectures about what we do that then can enter the scientific process? But could they give us conjectures that we had not thought of? And that's what I'm going to try and do today. I'm going to try and replace this messy human process by an algorithmic process. And you can sort of think of it like building a mirror. I'd like to build an algorithmic mirror, something we can look at that tells us something about ourselves that we didn't know, that there's some food stuck in our teeth, something we couldn't be aware of that we did not realize. This applies more broadly. I'm going to talk about it as behavioral science, but one of the areas where we're doing the same thing is in medical science, and I'll come to that at the end. You can see the same thing. So what do I want from this algorithmic process? This is the key to this talk. I'm going to try and set a high bar, and then you can tell me I haven't cleared it. But the high bar that I'll be setting today is it can't be black box prediction. We have many algorithms that can look at human behavior and say, I can predict this person. But that prediction is not what I want. I want the output of this whole chain to be a meaningful hypothesis. What I mean by meaningful is, one of my PhD students will come up with it. Okay? So, indistinguishable from human behavior. The second thing that I want from this procedure is I want this procedure, well, I'll skip this early work. There's some work on it, but let me tell you the early work, what is missing. A lot of times people will use, and I'm guilty of this, I will use an algorithm and then we'll build the model. The researcher, looks at the algorithm and will say, ooh, I have an idea. Well, did the algorithm actually produce that, or was it just there when it happened? That is not, I don't want today to say we built an algorithm, we looked at it and had this idea. I'm going to build a pipeline where there's a transparent role for the algorithm. I'm not going to ever look at it. I'm going to have like an experiment, like an entire pipeline where humans, subjects just interact with the algorithm and pop out the hypothesis. And that's what we're going to do.
So we have a question from online, and others are free to post them there too. Just to clarify, can you say more about how you're defining algorithm?
Good point. So great question. Here, I'm going to define an algorithm here in the very narrow sense of a supervised learning algorithm that's going to take input on data and then output a prediction.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'm going to take that algorithm and solve the challenge of interpretability. take that supervised learning algorithm and then have some meaningful human to machine communication.
When you say a meaningful hypothesis, do you mean like a causal hypothesis?
No, great question. See, once we get into this world of testing, that's when we say, is this hypothesis causal? Is it true? There's a bunch of stuff that's testing, but it's a hypothesis that is worthy of testing. So it is causal in the sense, but evaluating that it's causal is what happens in the second stage of science. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But in a sense, it is like drawing connections between.
Beautiful. That's right. The hypothesis intended to be causal. The testing is what will verify.
It's also meant to be interesting. I mean, early computer generated theorem proving generated a lot of theorems like 1 + 1 = 2.
Exactly. Very good. Great point. I should add to here, it should generate a meaningful new hypothesis, something that we haven't thought of. And it's interesting.
I mean, that I don't know if that's too subjective, but
No, let's put
yeah,
it on.
yeah.
That's exactly right. That's the
there's an
goal.
infinite number of arithmetic hypotheses.
Exactly right. All right. So today I'm going to work through in one example in detail. I think the example is interesting in its own right. It's about criminal justice. But what I also hope you take away is that the tool that I use to solve the central problem, this problem between a supervised learning algorithm that seems to have understood something about people and us trying to say, well, what did you understand? What interesting aspect of human behavior did you get that I don't know? And so that tool, I think, could be applied more broadly. All right. Now that was the preface. Now let me dive into what the talk is going to be actually about. Every year in the United States, there are 12 million arrests. Now, when I first heard this number, every year, 12 million, when I first heard this number, this is mind-boggling. I mean, think of how big the United States is. This is probably the one thing America does extremely well. we are still exceptional with this activity. We arrest people. It's crazy the amount that happens. Shortly after arrest, the judge makes a decision. Within about 24 hours, you face a judge who says, okay, trial is going to happen, but between now and trial, I have to decide as the judge, are you going to wait in jail or am I going to send you home? This is no small decision. In most jurisdictions, if you're sent to jail, you'll wait 2 to 3 months. In some, you might wait up to a year. This is why many times, if you were convicted, the sentence is time served. Because just waiting, think of how outrageous this thing is. You did nothing wrong. You were innocent, you were arrested. The judge says, put him in jail. Now that's it. Your livelihood is gone, your life is screwed. But take the other side of the coin. Someone is guilty and committed a serious crime. The judge sends them home and they proceed to commit another very serious crime. We had the person. This is one of those trade-offs where there's no, it's wrong and bad in both directions. And it's very, very weighty and problematic. So the pretrial release decision is consequential. It's based on a prediction. By law, the judge is supposed to look at the person and say, do they pose a flight risk? Do they pose crime risk, a safety risk? Supposed to form those decisions. Will the defendant flee? Will the defendant commit a crime? And then use that prediction to make a judgment. I just want to flag, this is very different from other judicial decisions, such as sentencing. When the judge goes to sentence somebody, they're not just asking these two narrow questions. They're asking questions about justice, about remorse, about fairness. They're asking deep, deep questions that you can't just predict your way out of that. Here, they're supposed to answer these questions.
So is there always only 2 possibilities? Stay in jail or be released?
Great
or is
question.
there like monitoring, or is it say maybe monitoring? Like I wouldn't normally want the government watching what I do, but maybe I'd be willing to do that to not be in jail for 3 months.
Great question, James. So the other choices, there's one choice, which is
So
how much
I don't know whether we should, I get a message, we should repeat those, but you were so close. I think, Susan, could everyone hear that? Or should I repeat it? Or should James repeat it?
Let's repeat it just to be safe.
Why don't you repeat it right to the mic?
So the question was, are there only 2 choices to be wait in jail for your trial or to be released? Is there a third choice of potentially monitoring or something else?
And the answer is there's quite a few other things the judge can do. So one thing they can do besides just release not is to set a bail amount. And if you hit the bail, then you release it not. Besides release or not, they can release with, as you say, monitoring. Monitoring actually comes as a technology solution people are looking at, like ankle bracelets and things like that, which is a form of technological monitoring. And then there's community monitoring, where you're released, but the community agrees to monitor you. So there is quite a few variables. Today, I'm just going to focus on, did the person get out or not? But the variation of that stuff is very interesting. And I'm limited by the data we have. Okay. I just want to tell you there's very interesting evidence on what drives judges to do what they do that is not just about risk. Okay. And so I'll give you some examples because some of this work is just incredible. We're all very familiar that racial factors appear to play a big role, but so do other things. For example, if the football team in your city loses, the judge is much harsher the day after. If it's a hot day, judges are much less lenient. So there's a bunch of factors like this that sort of people have been creative about coming up with factors, and then they tested them, and some of them have proven to be true. And you can list many more such examples. There's other work at the other side, which is indirect, which is earlier work that we had done, where we just say, let me predict risk instead of the judge, and say, can I do better than the judge? And there we find we do much better than the judge at rank ordering. You could release a lot more people than judges do and not end up with any more crime, simply because they are jailing a bunch of low-risk people and releasing a bunch of high-risk people. They're just not rank ordering. That doesn't tell me why. That doesn't give me an interpretable hypothesis. That just says there's a problem. So the goal today is going to be to find novel factors that influence judge decisions. The primary goal for most of this talk is going to be to answer the question, what drives the jailing decision? At the end of the talk, I'll say, if I found something interesting, does it also relate to risk? But the first fact is just to look at behavior, and then we'll come back to, was it the right thing? Yeah.
The assumption that there's only two objectives is going to do a lot of the work, right? Like so if judges are treating differently two defendants who are equal flight risks, but one has a kid, or one is going to lose their job in a different way, or something, like has a job to lose, which could matter sort of normatively, then it could be that like the algorithm's doing better because it's a different objective, right? Or it could also mean, I guess, that it's not like a bias where you're detecting, right?
Absolutely. So what I should say here, so two comments. So the question was, the fact that judges only have these two objectives is doing a lot of the work. And the answer is, in this previous paper, where it was truly algorithm versus humans, like a third of the paper was on that question, which we call the admitted payoff bias. And that is an important question. Could judges have other payoffs, other things they care about? For this talk today, I think you'll see it's a lot less important. And the reason is I'm actually not trying to say this, the algorithm beat the judge. I'm going to turn the algorithm on the judge and ask what drives the judge. Then we can look at what hypothesis comes up and say, is it plausible that that's a preference? Is it, and as society, would we be okay with that as a preference? Is it plausible that it's related to risk? Could I look at risk? So it's a little different, but that issue does matter here as well. Yeah.
A question I have about risk is that it's my understanding that going to jail, even in pretrial detention, makes it more likely that you will commit a crime later because you lose your job, you lose your social support network, and you lose the acceptable ways to make money. So wouldn't putting someone in jail actually like how are you isolating the causes behind them later committing a crime? Like it could be that they went to jail for pretrial. It could be that they didn't go to jail, they were released and recommitted, quote unquote.
Totally.
So how do you like
here
deal with that
risk
here?
is only in that window.
Repeat.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Given that going to jail, let me make sure I got it. Given that going to jail itself does seem to influence whether you end up committing a crime later, because jail is criminalizing, then how do we actually estimate risk?
Mhm.
So in this case, we care about the risk in that window when you're out waiting for trial. So it's not your long-term risk. The only risk the judge cares about is that 3 to 12-month window. So people who went to jail actually aren't even in that data to estimate the risk. Having said that, I do want to emphasize this talk isn't going to be about risk. It's just going to be about what even drives judge behaviors. Then we can come back and say, hey, does that look like risk? Does that make sense? But your question is totally on target. Please.
One more question following up on the previous two. We're focusing very much on sort of like what drives judges and judges' behavior, but I wonder if beyond what judges care about and whether defendants flee or will commit a crime, like do we have other responsibilities to the defendants that go beyond that? So we know that structural factors impact whether you're going to be rearrested or flee. Living in poverty makes you much more likely to not have the support that you need. And also being Black in America means that you're going to be re-arrested with a much higher risk. So how do you weigh that in this equation?
So the question is, here we're focused on what the judge does. And shouldn't we also be focused on all these other factors, such as the environment you live in, structural racism? We absolutely should be focused on that. There's a whole amount of work that does that. But I want to point out, if the judge is using factors about people that we don't think they should be using, that is a big form of inequity as well. And so the world has inequities we understand, and here we might find another inequity that we hadn't contemplated. And judicial power is absolute at some level, and so we should be interested in the factors that drive these absolute decisions. Does that make sense? Okay, so here's my approach. I'm going to throw everything in and predict the judge. I'm going to see if we find anything new. If I find something that predicts the judge that's new and, as Eric says, interesting, then to figure out, I have to solve the core interpretability problem. What is the algorithm finding? And then I need to see, can people communicate and understand what the algorithm found? At the very end, I'm going to test it. So, but again, that's not central to what I do. This is not a paper about hypothesis testing, it's about hypothesis generation. Okay, so let's just throw everything in. Here's what we do. I'm going to go through this bit pretty fast. This is from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. We have about 41,000 data points. The outcome we have, to James's point, there's more than release or not, but in this data set, we see whether they actually went home or not. That's the main thing we see. We see if they committed a crime, but only if they were released. If they weren't released, they couldn't commit a crime because they were in jail. And we have all the covariates. At this point, what we do, we take everything in the data, we throw it into a supervised learning algorithm, and we say, just predict what the judge will do. It's not about risk, just what will the judge do. And I'll skip this bit. This is, everything I'm going to show you today is in a validation set. It's all unpolluted. There's no overfitting, so we'll skip this. This is the model architecture. I don't think you want to know this. Okay, first interesting fact. This is the ROC curve for how well we've managed to predict the judge. Okay. Let me try and interpret this for you. It gets to an AUC of 0.71. So what is 0.71 and how should you think about it? Here's a fact about AUC, which people overlook a lot. If you pick two defendants, one released and one jailed, and you ask the question, what are the odds that the algorithm predicted higher jailing probability for the person who was actually jailed? Okay, so if the algorithm knew nothing, that would be 50%. If the algorithm knew it perfectly, that would be 100%. AUC is exactly the answer to that question. So it means if I pick a random defendant who's jailed and a random defendant who's released, the algorithm gets to an AUC of 0.71. So there's variation left, but there's still signal. Okay. Now, what I want to ask with this simple algorithm is, this tells us judges are to a degree predictable. But we already know one thing the judge should produce that should predict their judge decisions, which is crime risk. Like that's what they were supposed to be doing. So the fact that it's predictable doesn't tell us much. So let me build an algorithm that just predicts crime risk. This is a new algorithm that predicts crime risk. And now I'm going to take my original judge predictor and I'm going to plot it against crime risk. And what you're going to see is, yes, the curve goes up, but it's a correlation of about 0.23, which means the algorithm has discovered that judges care about this thing called risk. It's not an interesting discovery. We already knew all that. But it also tells us there's a lot of stuff that seems to move judges, which is not risk. So what is that stuff? What else is the algorithm looking at? Before I get into the depth of interpretability, what we decided to do was just the crudest possible thing you can imagine, which is a very first pass as to, we threw in this mishmash of data. Which parts of the data were driving this predictability? Where was all this signal coming from? So there are some very, very old techniques around variable importance. So all I do is I take the predictor, I destroy information, and I ask how much does its predictive power drop? And I destroy pieces of information. And then it tells me which information where I destroy in my data set shows the biggest drop in AUC. This is a very crude activity. Go ahead.
Just to make, so I can kind of understand this predicted crime risk and how, suppose a judge was perfect. There's somebody who always committed crimes and they always put him in jail.
Right.
Then you'd never have an observation of
That's
them committing a crime. So talk us through a little bit about what this data can say about cases like that.
So what is important for this is that we have people who are observably similar
Mhm.
who are being released, who commit crimes,
Mhm.
to people who are observably similar who are being jailed.
Observably similar to the judge, not to us.
Observably similar to us, not to the judge, the other way around.
Yeah.
That is, on the observables that we have, those people look similar. To the judge, they may look very
See,
different.
that could be the key. Maybe the
that's the
judge
key.
sees something.
That's exactly right. So what we would do if we were very interested in pinning down this risk element is that we would have to ask, could there be some unobservable differences between the released and the jail? And in that 2018 paper we're building on, 1/3 of the paper went to the omitted payoff bias. The other third went to exactly the selective labels problem.
Mhm.
So there we use all the sort of exogenous variation in the data to see how there's movement at the margin, to see how big the unobservable problem is. At the end of the talk, I'll come back and reuse that machinery to see what we can do about it. But here, I'm not using this to say the judge has done anything wrong. I'm just saying if I look at risk, it's not predictive. Something else is predictive. So I'm just kind of curious what else that thing is.
Well, it's not predictive based on the variables that the machine can look at.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
the judge may or may not have some secret
Absolutely.
intuition that's super good and you wouldn't know.
And it's totally possible. Exactly.
Okay.
So again, this is not meant to impugn the judge.
Yeah.
It's meant to say something completely different. There's something other than this that predicts what the judge does.
Mhm.
What
Right.
is it?
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to do this variable importance pass. And you know what I'm going to find? So here are the things that predict above and beyond the things that matter. What was the current charge? Knowing what the current charge was is highly predictive. And that's one of the things we found in the 2018 paper, which is now sometimes called current charge bias. Above and beyond risk, the charge you have, the now is really overrated. And so, for example, you see here violent crime today really does matter. That's not interesting. We already knew this. But there's one other variable that really matters more than all of these. And that turns out to be the face. The pixels in the mugshot that was in the arrest record have a huge effect on what the judge will do. Now, I want to emphasize something. I keep using the word thick pixels. We didn't do anything. We didn't code these faces up for features. We just threw it in. So it's just a raw pixel image. The connet is just finding this. It's more than as important as the current charge. What about the faces at finding? Well, let's understand. Let's dig into this. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to ignore the big black box model. I'm now going to do a very specific exercise. I'm going to predict who the judge will release, knowing nothing other than the mugshot. That is all I'm going to use. Okay, yeah.
So how much is this like first like hypothesis generation step really just embedded in your like choice of features that you put in? But like you needed to like include the number of pixels. Like I think you mentioned weather. Like I don't know if weather is a feature.
Yeah,
or like,
I'm going to come to that. Yeah, the great question is how much of hypothesis generation depends on the data you have? All of it.
so you're doing a lot of that work still. Like another hypothesis people have said is like if the judge shares the first initial, the same as the defendant, that's going to create some
Well,
entropy.
my
You have to know that.
Well, my hypothesis is not the face. That's not interesting. My hypothesis is going to be what about the face? So I haven't even gotten going yet. So in that sense, I haven't told you what in the face. It's just a curious fact that the face matters. But what about the face? So we haven't generated a hypothesis yet. So let's see that and see what you think after that. I'm going to form a new predictor using only the face. This is its ROC curve. It has an AUC of 0.61. Just to remind you, the full model has an AUC of 0.71. That's by way of saying half of the predictable variation in what judges do is entirely explained by the face. Now, there's another way to see how big this effect is. Let's just look at average differences. if I took the full model and took someone who is below median risk and above median, below median likelihood of the judge to release and above median likelihood, this is the gap I see. If I use just the face pixels, look how I get to basically about 2/3 of that gap. Suppose I didn't do any of this prediction business. I just took everybody who had committed a felony and everybody who hadn't committed a felony. That's the gap. So just having a below versus above median face, according to the algorithm, is what, about 40%, 60% of having committed a felony, of having committed a violent crime. So this is all by way of saying we should be very curious what the algorithm is seeing in the face because it's doing a lot of work. But that's not a hypothesis. That's just saying something is happening in the face. This is the black box problem I mentioned earlier. We know something is happening in the face. We'd like to know what, okay? Yeah.
Wait, they had committed a felony or were charged?
Charge of felony. Thank you. Good call. Thank you.
Just a clarifying question. Does the judge see the mugshot, see the person in person, or
Great
what does the
question.
judge see of
Right.
the face? And is it the same face that these guys are, that the machine's looking at?
Yep. This fact is striking to me because the algorithm is handicapped. It only sees the mugshot. The judge has a person who sits in front of them on the day of the hearing. So the fact that we only see the mugshot means there's probably, if I could get that video, there's probably even more signal in the social psychology of that interaction that the algorithm is not picking up. And so whatever we're finding seems to persist all the way through that interaction to make it together.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, could just to be devil's advocate, it could go the other way. Maybe when they come to court, they're all cleaned up. The lawyer puts them in a nice suit, they shave. When they get their mugshot, maybe it's like
But
when they get
remember,
arrested.
but this is actually predicting actual behavior. The mugshot is ending up predicting the actual
Yeah,
behavior.
no,
So-
but I mean, there may, I don't know, it could be as much or more variation in the mugshot or the.
Oh,
and then
good,
the,
great
maybe
point.
when they come
No,
to
no,
court,
great point.
everyone looks the same. I don't know.
Great point, great point. You're right. Sorry, yes. I don't know what would happen with that other data. Maybe it has less or more signal,
Yeah.
but we know there's signal in the mugshot. Great point, great point. Okay. Now, we already know faces can matter. So in a way, this goes back to Erik's point. It's not surprising. Guess what's in the face? Every stereotype that we've studied for a long time: race, gender, age. So is the algorithm simply rediscovering this very well understood fact that humans discriminate against people of certain groups? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to simply engage in an activity which is not that complicated. In the holdout set, I'm going to predict what the judge does, and I'm going to control for things like this and see if the face predictor still predicts. That's it. Just going to be control for whatever you think I don't care about. So it's going to be a complicated table, but ultimately there's a coefficient, left-hand side judge release, right-hand side coefficient for the face model. Then I'm going to control for gender, age, race. And I'm going to show you what happens when I control for that. And you'll see the coefficient barely changes. So let's say that's fine. But you know what? That's not that much. There's another kind of stereotype. Above and beyond race, a well-known fact in literature is that skin tone is far more predictive than actually race is. And a lot of scholars have argued this. Now, we have demographics in our data. We don't have skin tone. It's in our data because it's in the pixels, but it's not a structured variable. That leads us to a little machinery that we need to set up, which I won't go into detail here, but basically we have a little mechanical Turk pipeline where photos are dropped in. People are going to rate it based on stuff. They're given a task like this. They're given, pick the skin tone. We're going to use this machinery again and again, so I won't go into it again, where people are going to be asked to rate it on other features. Whenever I need a facial feature, we're just going to go have people rate on those facial features. We're going to get several raters. We're going to aggregate. In the background, just assume I verified consensus and reliability of the measures. Okay. This is, for example, distribution of skin tone. Many people don't really appreciate how much overlap there is in these in-between regions. You can see there's a lot, there are many people coded as Black who have lighter skin tone than people coded as white. This is not these distributions are Black. And as a result, if you didn't know this literature, you might be surprised to find out that skin tone is far more predictive of what judges will do than race. Many people think of us dealing with racial bias, but skin tone bias is more problematic. But for our purposes, controlling for skin tone doesn't do much. The algorithm continues to find a lot of signal. So one other thing that's in progress right now is another feature, this sort of Afrocentric facial features, which is above and beyond skin tone, where the facial features are actually Afrocentric in nature. There's been some interesting work on that. We're coding that up right now, but I think that is given. So this is going from the stereotypes end, but you know, many of you may realize that psychologists have been studying faces for over half a century, and we know a lot about human faces. Children use faces to make judgments as early as, I think, 5. And research has identified tons of facial features that matter. One of my favorite papers in this area is by Ustroff and Todorov. They give people faces and they have them code them up, free text description of just how they describe the faces. They take those free text descriptions and do principal component analysis and find that a small set of features account for a large fraction of the variation that people see in faces. So I'm going to take the primary one of these, trustworthiness, dominance, attractiveness, and competence. I coded these 4 up for all of our mugshots. And I'm going to ask, does the algorithm simply find this? And it turns out first, these do matter. So for example, if you have a dominant face, you are much less likely to be released. If you have a trustworthy face, you are much more likely to be released. So they do matter. But on the other hand, controlling for them doesn't do much good with the algorithm. Now, you're probably starting to get a sinking feeling that the rest of this talk could be an endless cycle of, I have one more, I could control for one more. I have as much interest in that as you do, which is not at all. So we said, okay, what if we took another tack? What if we said, let's go from the other direction. Let's create an exercise where we show these mugshots to people. We give them incentives to guess which one the judge is going to jail and release. So any other feature that you might think of is going to be coded into those guesses, those human guesses. And let's see how the algorithm does relative to those human guesses. Is it just rediscovering the human guess structure? So that's what we do. We have subjects make incentivized guesses about release. We make the task very easy for them. They are given photos of the same gender, race, and age. So it's quite controlled, and they're given continuous feedback. They get a chance to get better and better. And this is the activity they engage in, 2 mugshots, which person's going to be released. Okay. Turns out humans do pretty well at this data. They get about an AUC of 0.56, which on these exact same images, the algorithm gets to about 0.63.
These are M-turkers.
These are M-turkers. Get to about 0.63. So, and as a result, the human guess is predictive, but when you control for the human guess, the algorithm remains highly predictive. So whatever the algorithm is finding, whether you start with the known features or you start from the other direction, it seems to be something new. So what I want to do now is to just end this little bit by pointing out one thing. I've almost made it seem like all these things don't matter. They do matter. And in addition, it's not that the algorithm isn't rediscovering these things. It is absolutely rediscovering these things. It's just not all that it's discovering. One way you can see that is if I simply regress the algorithm's prediction on these known features. Turns out they're highly predictive. Left-hand side algorithm's prediction, whether you're male, that determines what the algorithm will say. Your age determines what the algorithm will say. Skin tone, attractiveness, all these predict what the algorithm will say. The previous tables were not saying the algorithm ignores these things. It's found them. It's just found something else. So
when you have the M-turkers learn, you give them feedback as to whether they got the answer right. It'd be really interesting to know how much of it, how good they were just out of the box versus do they learn over time what the judges are looking for?
Awesome. So the question is, it'd be cool to see whether people get better at this activity and they learn. I'm going to show you a figure near the end that shows you an interesting way they do learn. And that's kind of revealing, I think. So definitely it's a great, go ahead, yeah.
So all the features you're saying we may rediscover and you control for are kind of about the person, but not necessarily the situation. So you could also think that I can see in a mugshot for what that person was arrested because they got into a fist fight, or you know they were
Absolutely.
yellow or orange jumpsuit, so maybe they were arrested for something more severe. So should I think of this controlling? I mean, I don't want you to continue to go piece by piece here, but should I think of this as also being controlled for, and you want to predict above it beyond that?
I do want to control for that, and that's part of why I'm including the human guess. Like if there is such obvious things in the signal, like tattoos, or the person that has a gash, or, that in principle, hopefully is caught in the human guess. So I think that there's a softness here, which is, on the one hand, I want to convince myself there's something new here. But ultimately, I'm trying to control for all that. And now the question is, the best way I can prove to you is there's something new here is to actually show you what it is finding. So I played defense against all the things I can imagine. Now let's play some offense. This is what I'm going to try now. The problem of finding offense is that answering the question what the algorithm is seeing is essential to this activity. Because if I stopped here, it's a discovery, but the most unsatisfying one you can imagine. Because we need it to interpret what it's finding, because without that, we would have simply replaced one black box, what's happening inside the judge, with another black box, what's happening inside the cognac. And that's possibly interesting, but not that interesting. And in this context, interpretability, though, is a hard problem. It's almost trite to say these convolutional nets are black boxes. But it is true. And the fundamental problem, I just want people who have not worked in this literature to appreciate, it's more primitive than inference. It's not about that I get the right coefficient. It's because these algorithms have huge numbers of parameters, and the vast majority of the parameters sit inside of them and have little to no meaning that we can attribute to them. So what I want to ask is, this is an active area of research. And what we need to do is to somehow take it and use it for what we do. So let me skip this bit and just talk through one approach that I think could be promising here, which is a whole set of work that's built off of gradients. Let me walk you through how the gradient approach works, and then we'll apply it here. So here's how the gradient approach works. Picture a point of image space. So every point here is some image, combination of pixels. This is the prediction function. That is, these contours are where the images that have the same predicted probability of release. I take a point, just a specific image. I form the gradient. Now let's just be clear what the gradient is. The gradient is, if I change pixel by pixel, which pixel change combination maximally increases the probability of release. That's what the gradient is. So that tells us which pixel changes matter. Now, this type of approach has been used to produce saliency maps. I can use this to therefore say which pixel combinations matter. Let me highlight those pixels. So for example, I got this off the internet. If you do this for cat detectors, you find these pixels matter. So let's do it for our case. This is a mugshot. Let's take our predictor, and we get nothing. Because what the saliency map tells us is the amazing fact that the algorithm looks at the face. The saliency map doesn't work for faces for a very simple intuitive reason. Saliency maps localize algorithms and tell you where the algorithm is looking. But we want face features, which are composite functions. Dominance is not about a scar in one particular place. Dominance is a holistic feature that aggregated up pixels from many parts, which is what the thing on the left is showing you.
I have a question about dominance, trustworthiness, those measures. Are these generally accepted, or is there still a lot of sort of dispute on whether they're accurate, especially when you look beyond sort of like WASP-y samples? Because I imagine it being highly contextual in some senses, subjective.
So they're clearly subjective. So these are all subjective measures. I think the part that's accepted is that we can elicit this from people and aggregate across raters in a way to get a reliable measure that's inter-rater reliable. So the thing that I was saying earlier with everything that I'm doing is the inter-rater reliability that you try to get up to is tries to aggregate that out. Yeah, so that, okay, so this is the interpretability problem we have. But let me propose a way to solve it. Here I form the gradient at a point with a given image. But why don't I follow the gradient? What I really want is a whole new face. Why don't I just keep iterating this procedure until I end up with a morphed face? Now I'd have a face and another image, which is a higher release probability. This approach almost works. It fails on one very basic point. which is where a lot of these interpretability techniques fail, which I'm going to show you just in this image already. See, when I showed you this, I said these are all images. They are all pixel combinations. Most pixel combinations are not faces.
Yeah.
The face manifold is a tiny sliver, like in 2 dimensions, it's just one line. Actually, in this huge dimensional space, it's a tiny thread because most pixel combinations do not form faces. As a result, if I did my morphing, I said morphed face, I don't get a morphed face. What I actually get is a morphed image, which looks nothing like a face. This is meaningless, what I was doing. This problem can be solved by just looking at this picture. It's a different interpretability technique that we've developed for some medical applications, but it involves 2 things. Model the manifold. So build a whole new machine learning model that is the model of the manifold of faces, and then morph within the manifold to get a morphed face. So we're going to combine an unsupervised learning and a supervised learning thing. Now, how do I get a manifold of faces? Well, that's exactly what a GAN is. And you know them for deepfakes, but they're actually a model of the data manifold. So that's what we do. We build a mugshot GAN, which I won't go into detail. It basically takes all our mugshots, and it tends to generate very realistic synthetic mugshots. So 2 of these are real, 2 of these are fake. And you can look as close as you want. I will warn you, I can never remember which one is which. So good luck. I can probably email you after which is real or fake. We're going to take these mugshots, and we're now going to morph them in this space following the gradient of the predictor. That now gives us a question of communication. I want to set up a pipeline. I take my face predictor. I take the data manifold. I use this morphing tool. I create pairs of images that are higher predicted probabilities. I show them to subjects. And then I ask subjects, what do you think the difference is? That's it. And I'm not going to do anything here except just run it through this mTurk tool. Now, let's do this pipeline for something we already know to see if it works for something where it's not a mysterious face predictor, but a face predictor that I knew what it was. So we built an age predictor. That produces image pairs like this. This person becomes this person. This person becomes this person, and so on. And so what we then do is we have subjects inspect these pairs of images and tell us what the hypothesis is. In this case, about 80% of them report either age or hair color as the difference between them. So in that sense, for like an easy known thing like age, the morphing seems to be working pretty well. Now let's do something ambitious. Let's actually have the judge predictor be morphed. That leads to image pairs like this. One of these predicted people is very high release probability, the other is low release probability. So you can see now what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about. This is what the algorithm is seeing, or a part of what's seen. It's not the whole story, but it's part of what it's seeing. So now we're going to have subjects inspect these things, and we're going to have them tell us what they see. This task is going to have a few features. Subjects are given feedback so they can learn what the algorithm is seeing. And we're going to ask, does meaningful algorithm to human communication happen? The way I'm going to measure that is I'm going to say, can users guess better than chance which one the algorithm thinks is high release? Second, when we ask users what they're seeing, do they articulate anything meaningful that they agree with each other? Third, we're going to take whatever they articulated and ask, does it actually predict what the algorithm does? That's going to be the loop I'm going to test. So let's do that. So the users guess better than chance. This is the figure. This is very close to the question you asked for the other one, which will show up again in a second. As in, look at the number of images. They actually do better than chance from the get-go. Whatever they see from the beginning. What's interesting though, even though with these GAN images, they can tell off the bat, there is some learning that happens. And here's what's happened. In this experiment, we actually intersperse between these GAN images, real images. And the outcome was what the judge actually did. And what you find is as they get going with the GAN, they actually get better and better on the real images. It's like they're learning the feature from the GAN, and then they're able to apply them on the real images, and they do better and better on the real image test. So there's to be some learning going on, but it's a transfer learning of the people. So can they articulate what they see? So now they're seeing something, what do they say? And it turns out they do say stuff. This is their entire word cloud. And if we tokenize this and reduce it, we actually found about 40% of them agree that well-groomed. So one of the features that they claim to be seeing is need to restore screen sharing. Did we lose screen sharing?
Should be, right?
Yeah, it looks like so. So we've got well-groomed. So that seems to be one of the features that the judge is actually paying a lot of attention to. Let's actually see if it's true. Like that's what the subjects think. So now we go back to this regression where we run the prediction, algorithmic prediction. We told you that the algorithm we discovered, gender, age, race, is well-groomed there. And in fact, yes, well-groomed is extremely predictive of what the algorithm is actually seeing. It is one of the features the algorithm has discovered. So to me, that's a sign that basically there has been some meaningful communication that has happened through this whole process. And now we have a hypothesis. And I think that I call that basically my original goal, can we extract a meaningful hypothesis? I think if a PhD student comes to me this, I'd say, oh, that's kind of interesting. And sure, let's test it. It's a little better than one of my PhD students' hypotheses because I think it has a little better than chance of being true because it was generated from the data. It wasn't just generated from intuition. I want to observe we didn't do it. This is hands above board. It's not like I went in and said I had this idea. And importantly, this is not a paper about well-groomed in that this was just one component of the predictive power. There's a lot of prediction left. The gradient can now be orthogonalized with respect to well-groomed, and the next feature can be done. I'll talk a little bit about that. That's what we're doing now. But before I do that, let me just tell you what happens if we test this hypothesis. You're probably curious what happens. So what we do is we don't need the algorithm anymore. All we need to do is take a fresh set of images and treat it like any other hypothesis. We get coders to code how well-groomed the defendants are. And we say, does that predict what the judge chooses? And in fact, it does. If you're better groomed, you have a much lower detention rate. Okay? You're about 28.7% more likely to be detained if you're not well-groomed. This is not an effect of race. If you put skin tone quartile on the x-axis and you put well-groomed differences, you see at every kind of skin tone level, well-groomed is very predictive. It stretches across race. Now, there's a question, which we all started with. Is well-groomed predictive of risk? Perhaps that's why it's doing it. Or is it because it biases judges above and beyond risk? This is in principle, easy question to answer, because I would condition on risk. But in practice, we encounter the problem Erik raised earlier, which is the selective labels problem. We only have data on the released. And so we would have to assume something else. So here, today, I'm going to assume selection on observables. The risk conditional on the observables for the release is the risk conditional on the observables. I'm not saying it's the only way to do it. We spent this whole paper fretting about this problem. But as a first pass test of this hypothesis, it's not unreasonable, I think. And so here what I show you is well-groomed is not proxying for other variables. You can see it's predictive, and it's predictive even after I start controlling for the known features, and it continues to be predictive even after I control for risk. It's not proxying for actual risk, at least in this selection on observables aspect of stuff. And well-groomed is a little bit predictive of risk, but I think that's related to the earlier point that's made. Is well-groomed predictive of outcome? A little bit, because it's actually predictive of risk, or because the people who are doing your arresting, which is the outcome, are themselves biased in the same way that judges are biased. So let me conclude, and we'll stop and we'll have 2 minutes for questions. I don't want you to think this is a paper about well-groomed. It's a paper about how to test. Exactly. You can see I got a haircut. It's about a paper about how we generate hypotheses. And it's not just a paper about judges or faces. I think this is kind of a procedure that we can do pretty uniformly. I think it can be applied whenever there's behavioral data to be predicted and rich input data. And to your point earlier, which input data do we want? Well, that's kind of the interesting thing. First of all, how novel are the hypotheses that we're going to generate? Well, since the algorithm must talk to us, the discoveries are limited by the imagination. If there are facial features we don't even have words for, this procedure cannot work. How could it? So these algorithms can help us unearth things that we have some understanding of, but not things that we have no conceptualization of. What data do we feed the algorithm? See, testing, everything that we're taught to do is about the careful curation of data and the creation of an experimental design. Here, creative experimental design is replaced by creative merging. don't think too much. What all can you merge in? Try to merge it all in. The richer and wider the data, the more optionality you have for discovering something. It's just a different approach. And part of what all this has made me realize is that the last 500 years have been about the rigorous tools to test our ideas. Yet science begins with something curiously unscientific. And while the pre-scientific process is a big part of what we do, it's under-formalized. We have an entire machinery for hypothesis testing. We have very little machinery to know what hypothesis generation looks like, or even to talk meaningfully about it. And I hope that one of the things that comes out of this is more interest in this earlier pre-scientific stage. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sendhil. There are some questions online, so let me ask one of the ones from online here. It says, do you look at heterogeneity among judges, or is this a view for the aggregate? Are there covariates for judges that can predict the extent to which they are affected by the faces? So do you have enough data to subdivide it that way?
Yeah, in this data set, we do not have judge identifiers, but to my last point, it would be amazing to do this all over again with a data set where you have not just judge identifiers, but factors about the judges, characteristics, even simple things like case order. It would be interesting to know if it turns out like the recent cases you had some predictive power for what you do. So I think the more we could, but we can't do that. But the more, it's a great question. The more we could enrich it, the better it would be.
Slightly related question is, I mean, so well-groomed matters. We still don't know if there's some omitted variable that may be correlated. Maybe there's like a gang of badly groomed people that is driving a lot of crimes or something, or there's something else that's correlated with what we're picking up here, right?
Yeah, so I think I would say this is a hypothesis generation talk, not a hypothesis testing talk. So what I would say is now we have one hypothesis well-groomed that we could then turn our entire testing machinery, because that's the thing we are good at. We know how to take a fixed hypothesis and blow it out of the water or verify it or whatever. And the questions you're describing are totally right. The one thing we're doing now, just at least in the data we have to go a little bit in that distance, is we're asking, well, I'll come back to that, but yeah, that'd be my answer, because I think you had a question that I want to make sure.
Go ahead. Someone down here have a question?
Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Jan.
I was curious about connecting this back to the example you started with about the kind of baby's heartbeats visible in the image. So this seems to be an extreme case because it's something that as a human I wouldn't have seen in the image, but somehow the machine still figures out. So I was wondering, I mean, I feel like you're already pushing in the direction of saying, let's make something visible that wasn't obvious before, but let's make it obvious in a way that is accessible to the human. Is there some way of exaggerating the things that we may still miss that may not be obvious by kind of going too far in the gradient? Like, is there some way of making visible what we're still missing that you see would be applicable here?
Amazing question.
Try to repeat.
Yeah, let me repeat the question. Jan is saying, if we go back to the babies example, there we had to exaggerate something so the humans could see it, the algorithms could see it without exaggeration. Is there an analog here where we should be trying to exaggerate so we can see yet more facial features? And I think that I have no answer to that other than to say, great question. And it's the kind of question that I think as we get into this hypothesis generation part of thinking, those are the kinds of questions I think we'll have to start answering. Like, how do we unpack more of the signal that we don't immediately have accessible? I would love to, it's a great question, and it would be interesting to know how we would even do that. Is it following the gradient more? Is it something else? And it's great.
One more question. Yeah.
When you take this idea of for hypothesis generation, and you look across domains, I mean, you're in judges decision making here, but you could use it for graduate school admissions. You could use it. Do you how would you judge that? Would you judge the quality of the data that's available as the primary driver of whether you think it would be a good line, or what would you?
Oh, great question, Claude. So the question is, this can be applied in other domains. How would we go about deciding whether a domain is particularly ripe for this activity? I think I'll tell you my gut into it. Like, you shouldn't believe anything I'm about to say, because an N of one generalization is always dangerous, but here's my N of one. I've done one. Here's what my thinking of what I think would be a fruitful next thing to try. The thing about faces is that it's information that we've collected that codes a lot more data than we realize. So I think any domain where we have input data on the right-hand side that is actually holding a lot more data than we know how to featureize is very promising. So if we have structured data set, so it's admissions and it's just SAT score, blah, 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 well, we've measured the things we've measured. But if I have the essay and we think there are language codes a lot more than we realize as code. So to me, it would be looking for those places where we've already collected data. So in medicine, for example, the X-ray, well, there's a lot in just a simple X-ray. Even an EKG has a lot. So for me, the promising areas are areas where we have a human behavior, but the inputs into that behavior include some rich inputs that we happen to have collected for some other reason. Is that?
Yeah.
So I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you so much, Sendhil. That was terrific. Much appreciated. Will work when people are wearing face masks. So our next seminar is going to be on December 6th. Thomas Poyo is going to be talking about the end of nation states. So join us for that. Thanks very much for joining us today. And thanks again, Sendhil.